Hi, everybody. Welcome to Horror Gallery. I am your host, Mother and Della Morte, and we're just going to give everybody a little bit of time to get in here while we finish out this last episode, part 3 of London's Magnificent Seven. And this is our season finale. So I'm super excited about this. Super, super excited. Let's see. Okay, just checking something out here. All right, good deal. So yeah. So I'm so glad to be here. We're going to be going over the actual Magnificent Seven cemeteries. Lots of really, really cool information here. I tried to grab just a little bit about each one, as well as maybe a particular ghost story that may be associated with one of, with a particular cemetery. So this is going to be a lot of fun. If you are new here, then definitely say hello. Let us know where you're from. We always like new victims here in the crypt, and we'll just give everybody a little bit of time to roll in. I'm going to go ahead and look at the chats real quick. And yes, I have been down with the fluvid, so my voice is a little on the cracky side. So hopefully I don't lose it tonight. Let's see. So we've got a couple of people in here already. Hi, Delphine. How are you? And then Calvin. Calvin's here. And Russ. Hi, Russ. Glad you're here. And of course, Stephen P. Kitty Cat. Hey, Stephen. How are you? And Akia. Akia's here. We are glad to have you here as well. We have Chris in the house. Hello. So yeah, guys, share out one of the cheapest, and actually it's free, ways to support your favorite streamers is just to share their stream. So if you know somebody that might be interested in what we're going to be doing tonight, definitely share that out. And let's spread some of this spookiness, most definitely. So it looks like we've got quite a number of people in here already. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I will say that I am super, super proud of these cemeteries, as it seems like London really knows how to grow a very, very good haunted cemetery. So I am super, super impressed with that. And we're going to go ahead and get started. If I mention things that you are not quite sure about, you may want to go back and catch part 1 or part 2. We kind of went into the sanitary conditions of London prior to these 7 cemeteries being put in place, and kind of their conception, why they came about, what all was going on, and basically everybody was just living in corpse juice. So it was pretty disgusting. And excuse me again about my voice. I am trying to get over this cold. So we're going to start out with Kensal Green Cemetery. Now, Kensal Green was originally known as the General Cemetery of All Souls. This is the oldest of the Magnificent Seven cemeteries in London, and it is still in operation. Now, Kensal Green Cemetery is in Kensal Green area of Queen's Park in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea in London. Inspired by Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, it was founded by the barrister George Frederick Carden. Now, the cemetery opened in 1833 and is comprised of 72 acres of grounds, which include 2 conservation areas adjoining a canal. The cemetery is home to at least 33 species of birds and other wildlife. Now, this distinctive cemetery has memorials ranging from large mausoleums, which house the rich and famous, and many distinctive smaller graves, and it also includes special areas dedicated to the very young. It has 3 chapels and serves all faiths. Now, one of the things I really did find interesting about all 7 of these is, and I know over here in the States, we're kind of, when you think of a cemetery or a graveyard, you think of all lands that are within those particular boundaries are consecrated. That is not the case with a lot of, or really with any of these particular cemeteries. You have consecrated areas that were specifically for like the Church of England and your Anglican type Christianity, and then you had the dissenters or like multiple faiths, things like that. They would be buried in the non-consecrated area. So now the cemetery was immortalized in the lines of J.K. Chesterton's poem, The Rolling English Road, from his book, The Flying Inn. And I quote, "For there is good news yet to hear and fine things to be seen before we go to paradise by the way of Kensal Green." Now, despite the Grecian style of this particular cemetery or the buildings within this particular cemetery, the cemetery itself is primarily Gothic in character, which we love. We absolutely love the old Gothic architecture. Now, due to the high number of private Gothic monuments, so that's kind of why that's the overall feel of this particular cemetery. Now, due to this atmosphere, the cemetery was the chosen location for several movie scenes. Now, as far as it being established and its design, now George Frederick Carden had failed with an earlier attempt to establish a British equivalent to the Paris model as far as the cemetery, which would have been the Père Lachaise cemetery. And he tried that first time in 1825, but it was kind of a flop. It didn't really go over. But a new committee established in February of 1830 gained more financial, political, and public support for the funding to go to the General Cemetery Company. And you're going to hear this name a lot in association with all 7 of these particular cemeteries. Now, a fun fact, and I thought was really kind of neat, one of the architects, which was a Thomas Wilson, he had previously proposed, before they had voted on the 7 cemeteries, it was an ambitious proposal, and it was going to be called the Metropolitan Sepulchre Project. Now, this would have been something to behold if they actually went through with it. Now, the Metropolitan Sepulchre was going to be a massive pyramid necropolis proposed for construction in the Primrose Hill area in London in the 19th century as way of addressing what we had spoken about earlier in part 1 and part 2, which was basically the shortage of burial spaces within the London area because it was growing so much. It would be designed by the architect Thomas Wilson, and it would have 90 stories and capable of holding up to 5 million of the dead. It would encompass 18 acres of its footprint of the pyramid and would have allowed a number of burials equal to 1,000 acres of regular cemetery ground. Now, Wilson said that not many centuries, however, will pass away before it will not only be completely filled, but there would be another one that would be required. So could you imagine a pyramid in the middle of London that is 90 stories tall and houses over 1,000 acres of the dead? Like, that would have been definitely something to see. I've got to say that. Now, of course, that was a flop that did not come to fruition. The pyramid would have been faced, if he would have been able to build it, with granite blocks and have flights of stairs on every side. And it would lead to an obelisk as well as an astronomical observatory at the pyramid's peak. Now, if you want to call Cthulhu, this is how you would probably call Cthulhu. The project would have cost around £7 million in that time, but it was never built, and the need for it was supplanted by the creation of a ring of garden cemeteries around London, which would be known as London's Magnificent Seven. Now, on July 11th of 1832, the Act of Parliament established, like I said, a general cemetery company for the interment of the dead in the neighborhood of the metropolis. It gained royal asset, and the act authorized it to raise up to £45,000 in shares, buy up 80 acres of land, and build a cemetery and a Church of England chapel. Company directors appointed after the bill received royal assessment, asserting their control and preference for a different style. One of the competition judges and a company shareholder, John Griffith of Finbury, who had previously produced working drawings for a boundary wall, ultimately designed the cemetery's two chapels and the main gateway, and 15,000 trees were supplied and planted for within this particular cemetery. Founded as the General Cemetery of All Souls, Kensal Green is the cemetery. It was the first of the Magnificent Seven garden-style cemeteries in London. It was consecrated on the 24th of January of 1833 by Charles James Bloomfield, the Bishop of London, and received its first funeral that same month. Now, to backtrack just a little bit, now in the early 1850s, after a series of cholera epidemics in London, it caused them to basically examine all of London's burial facilities, which were very, very disgusting and really found wanton. Of course, our good friend Edwin Chadwick was the one that proposed the closure of all existing burial grounds in the vicinity of London other than the privately owned Kensal Green Cemetery, which it was there, but it wasn't really what it is now. The overall layout of Kensal Green is on an east-west axis with a central path leading to a raised chapel towards the west. The entrance to the north and east and the largest monuments lie in the central path to the chapel. Now, the Church of England was allotted 39 acres, and the remaining 15 acres were separated and were given to, like I said, the dissenters, which would be the non-consecrated areas. A distinction deemed crucial at the time. Originally, in these particular cemeteries, you would see a divisional wall. And I know some people have probably seen pictures of that, where in some instances, like say maybe a family member was buried on one side versus a family member on the other side, and that kind of thing. And those were separated usually with what was called a sunken fence. Now, the small area designated for non-Anglican burials is approximately oval in shape and was formerly made prominent by a wider central axis path that terminated with the neoclassical chapel with curved colonnades. The Angelical Chapel dominates the western section of this cemetery, and being raised on a terrace beneath is what you would find an extensive catacomb. There is a hydraulic, and I'm going to do my best to pronounce this, a cataflacure. It's basically just a lift that would take, after a funeral, would basically lower the coffin down into the catacombs for it to be stored. It is still in operation today. Burials and cremations take place daily, although cremations are now more common than interments. The cemetery is still run by the General Cemetery Company under its original Act of Parliament, and this mandates that bodies that there may not be exhumed and cremated or the land sold for development. Once the cemetery has exhausted all its interment spaces and can no longer function as a cemetery, the mandate requires that it shall remain a memorial park. The General Cemetery Company constructed and runs the West London crematorium within the grounds of the cemetery as well. The cemetery is the burial site of approximately, this gives you an idea that there may be some shared graves going on, approximately 250,000 individuals that are placed in over 65,000 graves. So you got a lot more individuals than you have graves, which was not that uncommon back then, including upwards of 500 members of British nobility and 970 people listed in the Dictionary of National Biography. Many monuments, particularly the larger ones, lean precariously, however, as they have settled over time on the underlaying London clay. Now, the Anglican chapel is at the center, like I said, of the cemetery and contains several tombs. The chapel, however, was sadly damaged during the Second World War, but has been restored or was restored in 1954. Now, under the chapel, this particular chapel, there are also catacombs, one of the few that are left accessible in London. Now, this catacomb, however, now is currently not maintained, but can be visited as part of a guided tour. It still has a working coffin lift or caflicure That was restored by the Friends of Kensal Green Cemetery in 1997. As far as the Dissenters Chapel, it is situated in the eastern corner of the cemetery. This Greek revival structure was for the use of non-Anglican denominations and of non-believers. Now, only parts of the cemetery were consecrated, and dissenters could opt to be buried in the non-consecrated areas following a service there. The cemetery became favored by nonconformists, freethinkers, non-Christians, atheists, and thus the chapel became very popular. The Dissenters' Chapel had become derelict and partly roofless, so in 1995, it was leased to the Historic Chapels Trust, who undertook a $447,000 or pound, restoration. The chapel currently serves as the office of the Friends of Kensal Green Cemetery, but it is also available for funeral services. Now, as far as the catacombs, it has three. The cemetery has three catacombs for the deposit of lead-sealed, triple-shelled coffins and cremated remains. Catacomb A, beneath the North Terrace colonnade, is now sealed. Catacomb Z, beneath the Dissenters' Chapel at the eastern end of the cemetery, suffered significant bomb damage during World War II and is also closed to further deposits. Catacomb B, beneath the Anglican Church in the center of the cemetery, has space for some 4,000 deposits and still offers both private as well as shelf or vault areas for family groups. Just so you know, the catacomb extends under the entire footprint of the chapel and its colonnades. There are 6 aisles within each vault, which is numbered, running consecutively from the number 216 at the southwestern end of aisle 6. That's where you would be placed. That's where they have the spots open. Deposits within the catacombs of Kensal Green has always been more expensive and prestigious than burial in a simple plot in the ground as far as this cemetery is concerned, although less costly than a brick-lined grave or mausoleum. Without the further expense and responsibility of a monument above the grave, the catacomb have offered a secure yet dignified and exclusive resting place for the well-to-do, particularly the unmarried, the childless, and the young children of those without family plots or mausoleums elsewhere. Now, some of the notable interns or burials at this particular cemetery: Betsy Bolcom. She was a young girl and a close friend and confidant of Napoleon Bonaparte during his imprisonment at St. Helena Island. We also have, or they have, I should say, Marigold Frances Churchill. And yes, she is the daughter of Sir Winston Churchill and Lady Clementine Churchill, who died from a fever in 1921 at the age of 3. In 2019, the Churchill family acted on a long-held desire to reunite Marigold's remains with the rest of their family in the Baldon churchyard. The empty grave and monument will remain at Kensal Green, however. Also interned is Henry Jean-Baptiste Victoire Fidel. He was a Francisco English Victorian painter, as well as George Frederick Carden. He was the founder of the cemetery, so he's buried there too. As of British royalty, Prince Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex and son of King George III, Princess Sophia, sister of and daughter of King George III, Prince George, Duke of Cambridge, grandson of King George III, and Commander-in-Chief of the British Army. Now, notable cremations for this particular cemetery would be Freddie Mercury. He was the singer of the rock band Queen. I think everybody knows who Freddie Mercury is. So yeah, he was cremated and is now interned there at Kensal Green. So we also have, and I'm going to get to the comments before we move on to the next cemetery. We also have some video material for you. So if Oz behind the curtain, if you will go ahead and play the first section of the video. This is Kensal Green, and then we are going to get into the ghost story surrounding Kensal Green. Okay, we can stop there. We actually probably need to back up a little bit because I don't know if that is the next one or not. Hang on just a second. Yeah, let's back up to West Norwood Cemetery, which should be right about there. Yeah. Whoop. Yeah. Okay. All right. Perfect. All right. So let's get into the ghost story that surrounds this particular one. And there was a lot of information that went with Kensal Green because there's just it's pretty big. There's a lot going on there. The other ones aren't going to be quite as in depth. But as far as the actual folklore or ghost stories that go along with this particular cemetery is known for the living dead girl of Kensal Green Cemetery. Now, the following story supposedly was first published in 1936 in a collection titled True Ghost Stories. The book's author, a Marchioness Townsend and Maud Flokes, it's the best way I can pronounce it, introduced the tale with the statement, the facts of this story were vouched for by the late Honorable Alec Carlisle, who told them to Maud M.C. Folks. So, of course, I guess that makes it true. But it's still an interesting story. It's still a very interesting story. So, a man of common birth, through determined networking and resourcefulness in the business this individual had, over time, managed to propel himself into the upper echelons of society. His success was not without sacrifice, however. Along the way, he had to abandon his former lover, the girl, Elsie. Now, she is described as being in possession of no working brains and no money to speak of. The man had decided that the company of his lowbrow or low-born girlfriend was really unbefitting of his rapid social ascent, and so he left her where she was. By the time she was carried to an early grave, he had already long forgotten her. Many years later, the man was attending the funeral of a colleague held at London's Kensal Green Cemetery. After the ceremony, the man wandered deep into the cemetery and was startled when he came across Elsie's grave. It lay in one of the wilder corners of this 72-acre cemetery, an unattended grave far removed from the grand mausoleums of Kensal Green's more affluent interments. The plain cross was planted in bare clay and leaned at a crooked angle. The sight left him with pangs of guilt, and though the publisher, or the man, he was a publisher, tried to swallow his emotions, he nevertheless felt somehow obligated to improve the resting place of his one-time lover. Rather than have his own name associated with the grave of a lowly girl, however, and to suffer the gossip and speculation that would bring about doubt and possible ruin, the man decided to act through an agent. He settled on the plan of calling a stockbroker and having the man put forward funds for a more fitting memorial to Elsie. The man was out of sorts by the time he returned home that evening, and his mind filled with long forgotten memories of Elsie. He picked up the phone to dial for his stockbroker, but in his confused state found himself reciting a Kensal Green plot number to the operator. He was about to correct himself, but the operator had already put him through. Moments later, the call was picked up. A muffled voice asked, "Yes? Who's calling?" And the bemused man spoke his name, to be met with a gasp of delight. The voice, becoming clearer now, was unmistakably that of Elsie. "Why, it's never you, darling," she said. "Do you want me? Of course I'll come." The man wanted to refuse, but put the phone down and could find himself basically stunned into silence. "I won't be long," said Elsie, "but I was very far away, darling, when you rang up." There was a click and the line went dead. The man, now in a state of some shock, retired to his study. Dismissing his servants, he poured himself a tall brandy, and then another, and as he waited in anticipation, he was already well intoxicated by the time he heard his front door open, followed by footsteps in the hall. The sounds, sluggish, stiff, and scraping, came closer and closer until the study door began to move. Its handle operated from the other side. At this point, the hapless man passed out, his faint induced by a cocktail of fear and brandy. The man woke the next morning to find streaks of dark clay on his carpet, tracing a path from his front door along the hallway to his study. There was clay on the door handle and on his chair and even on his jacket, but no sign of his midnight visitor. While ghost stories like this often end with a moment of revelation, the transformation of a character suddenly inspired towards a life of charity, there is no such change in this man. Instead, the man remained as miserable, miserly, and antisocial as he had ever been. Only from this point on, however, he suffered a strong aversion to clay and never once attended another funeral. So let's see what's going on in the comments real quick, because I know that was a long one. Let's see what we've got going on. All right. Oh my goodness, there's a bunch of people in here. Hi, Raz. How are you? Nadine. Hey, Dizzy. And let's see. Hexus is here, and it says, "How I've waited for you to come. I've been here all alone. Now that you've arrived, please stay a while, and I promise I won't keep you long. I'll keep you forever. Graze the skin with my fingertips. The brush of dead, cold flesh appeases the means, provoking images, delicate features, so smooth a pleasant fragrance in the light of the moon. Dance with the dead in my dreams, listen to their hollow screams. The dead have taken my soul, temptations lost all control." Let's see. And so Hexa says that the Dissenters Chapel in Kensal Green sounds like it became the chapel. It became a Bohemian center of England. There are some really cool other ones too, but yes, it did become extremely popular. And Nadine says, "Living Dead Girl." Hi, Jenny. How are you? All right. So we'll get on to our next one. So the next one in line, it was originally known as the South Metropolitan Cemetery, and it was the first cemetery in the world to actually use the Gothic style, like in its plan, I guess I should say. The Kensal Green did become overall Gothic, even though I think it was planned to be like a Grecian style. But this one was actually planned to be Gothic, and it was the first in the world to take on that particular architectural style. So there, yeah, that. So we're going to talk about West Norwood Cemetery. Now, West Norwood Cemetery is 40 acres. It's a rural cemetery in West Norwood in London, England. It was also known as, like I said, the Southern Metropolitan Cemetery. Now, one of the first private landscape cemeteries in London, and is a site of major historical, architectural, and ecological interest. Its grounds are a mixture of historic monumental cemetery and modern lawn cemetery, but it also has catacombs as well, cremation plots, and I spelled this out phonetically, a columbarium. Okay, so a columbarium is, think of Phantasm. Remember the big mausoleum in Phantasm? This would be, well, it could be smaller, but think of something like that. And rather than bodies that were interned in these drawers, it's actually cremated remains. It's urns. You can see these in some memorial gardens. They'll look kind of like a big, large square section. They'll do these for like people that have been cremated to store their urns and things like that in the columbariums. So that's what that is. Now, and it has one of those as well for the incendiary ashes. Now, the cemetery's crematorium still operates today, and crematorium plots are still available. But all the conventional burial plots have been allocated, and hence it is closed to new burials pending further agreements under current burial legislation. So in other words, they've ran out of room. If you haven't already bought a plot, You're pretty much out of luck unless they expand. Now, believed by some to hold the finest collection of sepulchre monuments in London, the cemetery features 69 grade 2 listed buildings and structures. And they do that by, I think, grade 2, or they're nice, but they're not like grade 1. So it has a lot of really nice pieces that can still be seen. Now, grade 2 is not bad either. It includes an area that's dedicated to the Greek Orthodox necropolis with 19 listed mausoleums and monuments. It is one of the magnificent 7 metropolitan lawn cemeteries of the Victorian era, and its extensive Gothic revival architecture qualifies it as one of the significant cemeteries in Europe. The entrance gate is set within railings painted a historically accurate spice brown. Railings and walls were kept high during this time to help dispel fears of body snatchers. It is a mixture of cleared, manicured, and mature landscaping and includes Anglican and non-secrated burial grounds, a crematorium, a memorial garden, the columbarium, a rotunda, a chapel, vaults, and catacombs on top of gentle rolling hills, with views across South London. The large plot on the central higher ground and by the main drives were originally sold as prime locations and are the site of some of the grander Anglican monuments and mausolea, while the Greek Orthodox necropolis in the northeast contains a high density of neoclassical architecture. Many of these mausolea are listed, such as the Grade 2 mausoleum for Sir Henry Dulant's family. It was constructed appropriately of pottery and terracotta, so that's what his family were into. As a contrast, just a few yards to the west of the crematorium is the very simple headstone to Isabella Mary Mason Beaton, aka Mrs. Beaton. She was the Victorian cookery writer, so she was did a lot of cookbooks and things like that. The cemetery was founded by its own Act of Parliament of 1836 and consecrated for its first burials in 1837. By 2000, there had been 164,000 burials, a lot more shared graves in this one, in 42,000 plots, plus 34,000 cremations and several thousand interments in its catacombs. The site of the cemetery is part of the ancient Great North Wood, for which its name, Norwood, took its name. Now, a large number of inventors, engineers, architects, and builders, such as Sir Hiram Maxim, he was the inventor of the automatic machine gun. Sir Henry Bessemer, he was the engineer and inventor of the famous steel process. James Henry Greathead, who tunneled much of London's underground. And William Burgess and Sir William Tithe, which were Gothic architects. Now, an interesting and fun fact, in 1847, some 12,000 remains, and we talked about this in part 2, were taken from the burial vaults beneath Enon Chapel near the Strand. And we know the story about that because there was a really big public health scandal and was brought by George Walker, a prominent surgeon, who had all the bodies moved to the Norwood Cemetery for reburial in a single mass grave. So they're buried here at Norwood. Now, this one doesn't have a whole lot of like specific ghosts that are dedicated to it. Believe it or not, you would think that there would be. But I did find a few. But let's go ahead, Oz behind the curtain, and let's take a look at Norwood Cemetery. All right, we can stop there. So the particular area in this particular cemetery seems to really be attached to the catacombs. The catacombs are considered haunted. Where the Dissenters Chapel stood, a crematorium was built, and the catacombs beneath now house the furnace. It's just kind of creepy. Reminds me of like Nightmare on Elm Street for some reason. I don't know why. But those beneath the Episcopal Chapel still remain relatively untouched, still filled with thousands of coffins, and with the vaulted ceilings still intact and preserved. Now, superstitious local residents would tell you that the ghosts of those buried there still walk the narrow underground corridors. And sadly, due to the health and safety concerns, the catacombs remain closed to the public. However, there are times when they are sometimes opened on special occasions by tour. Now we're going to move on to the next one in line. It became the main burial place of the English nonconformists. And this particular cemetery is Abney Park. Now, Abney Park in Stoke Newton in London, in the London borough of Hackney, is a historic parkland originally laid out in the early 18th century by Lady Mary Abney and Dr. Isaac Watts and the neighboring Hartop family. In the 1840s, it became a non-denominational garden cemetery, a semi-public park arboretum, and an educational institute. So it was really seen more as a park, really from the very beginning of its conception. And it was widely celebrated as an example of its time. A total of 196,843 burials have taken place there upon up to the year 2000. It is now, however, considered a local nature preserve. The cemetery is named after Sir Thomas Abney, who served as Lord Mayor of London from 1700 to 1701. The mayor of Stoke Newton belonged to him in the early 18th century, and his townhouse, Abney House, built in 1676, stood on the site of the present cemetery until its demolition in 1830. So basically, where his house, where his estate was, is where the cemetery now stands. Now, in 1840, Abney Park opened as a model garden cemetery, a pioneering non-denominational place of rest. Its approach was based on the Congregational Church's role in the London Missionary Society. Those fundamental principles were to develop a wholly non-denominational exemplar. It also drew on American burial ideas, specifically those of Mount Auburn in Massachusetts. At first, there were many links between Abney Park Cemetery and the nonconformists, in particular the Congregationalists. That period came to a close in the early 1880s when a strict commercial general cemetery company was formed and the land at Abney Park was made over to the new enterprise. And what I had read is actually this particular cemetery, its conception was really big about owning your own plot. I mean, literally owning your own plot. And that is not really, from what I kind of understand through my research, the idea that they have in England. Most everything is owned by the crown. Now, you can purchase cemetery plots where your body will stay in perpetuity, which means forever, but you cannot own it. And there was a really big back and forth to do with this particular cemetery once that commercial general cemetery company came in. So it's kind of interesting to read about. You can look more into it on Google if you want to. Now, Abney Park has a claim to be the earliest complete design for a permanent Egyptian revival entranceway at a cemetery anywhere in the world. The gateway at Mount Auburn Cemetery, from which it took its inspiration, was at that time still a temporary structure, being made of dusted wood and sand. Now, its permanent design was not built until 2 years after Abney Park opened, so Abney Park gets to take that claim. Now, in England, there were already some examples of the use of Egyptian revival architecture on a small scale, including one example of a small gate installed at a cemetery for nonconformists near Sheffield in 1836. However, Abney Park Cemetery became the first to employ the style for cemetery buildings, and also the first to introduce it for a complete entrance design. At Abney Park, the use of motifs not associated with contemporary faith served a profound purpose, since it was consciously opened as the first wholly non-denominational garden cemetery in Europe. Such an elaborate planting scheme for a park cemetery may also be a reflection of the symbolic importance of the founding director's attachment to the land that formed Abney Park Cemetery, and as well that he was a nonconformist. Now, notable burials or internments at this particular cemetery, that would be William and Catherine Booth. They are founders of the Salvation Army. Dr. Thomas Binney, he is the Archbishop of Nonconformity, has a portrait at the National Portrait Gallery that shows him at the Anti-Slavery Society Convention in 1840. Binney is buried close to the Church Street entrance at Abney Park. Give me just a second. Christopher Newman Hall, who was influential on the side of slavery emancipation in the American Civil War, is buried there with his father. So is Reverend James Sherman, who wrote the introduction to Harriet Beecher Stowe's hugely influential Uncle Tom's Cabin. The novel was partly based on Josiah Henson, whose escape to freedom in Britain was assisted by the philanthropist Samuel Morley, who is buried also at the cemetery. Let's see, Reverend Joseph Keatley, a Congregational missionary and abolitionist in Demaria, is also interned here, as is Reverend Dr. John Morrison, patron of the escaped slave and influential African American biographer Moses Roper. Also interned, the world record holder in motor pace cycling, Tommy Hall, and a public hangman by the name of William Calcraft. Frank C. Bostock is remembered, he's also interned here, largely due to the dominance of his life-size marble lion alongside a path close to the chapel. Along with the Wombwells, the Boxtons were mainly responsible for bringing Asian and African animals to the attention of the Victorian and Edwardian public. So the menageries, you can thank this particular family for kind of bringing that into conception. And for part of the year, giraffes used to live close to the cemetery at a small farm on the Yokeley Road. Interesting facts, though, related to this particular cemetery. There's a small Blitz memorial that records civilian deaths closer to the southern entrance at Abney Park. Though it suffered extensive property damage, talking about Abney Park, during the war, Stockton Newton's death toll was relatively low by the standards of some other Hackney districts like Shoreditch. And it would have been lower still were it not for one incident on October 13th, 1940, when a German bomb made a direct hit on a crowded shelter at the Coronation Avenue, just off the High Street. And we talked about this. This was actually something that the Blackout Ripper took advantage of, was this particular disaster. And it's when basically a bomb hit the Tunnel Avenue station for the underground rail cars. And a bunch of people were killed. Most people that were in that shelter seeking shelter from the bombing were killed. And as the illustration shows that you can find online, the list of the dead from this one incident takes up nearly 3 of the 4 panels on the memorial. Many of the dead, unfortunately, were Jewish, and some were refugees who had escaped the Nazis. Now, mind you, it is not all fun and games at Abney Park. It's been said that also related to this park, there is an unexploded World War II bomb which still lies buried somewhere on the grounds. And you'll see why it would be hard to find it. Also, if you are a mushroomer, you do not want to mess with the mushrooms at this particular cemetery. Rumor has it that the tasty looking mushrooms you might see there are bursting with arsenic, thanks to the Victorians' unwholesome custom of embalming their corpses in arsenic. So don't pick the mushrooms. They're still laced with arsenic, apparently, from all the arsenic that was in the embalmed internments there. So let's go ahead and we'll take a look at Abney Park. All right, we stop there. All right, so this particular cemetery has a very interesting story that is associated with it. Some of you may have heard of this story before. It's called the Stoke Newtonton Nursery Vanishing. Now, beneath the wild turned trees that spread in every direction from the ruined chapel at the cemetery's heart lie forgotten numbers of graves. One of them, maybe, belongs to one Alice Mayhew. If so, and if you could find a 19th century headstone, it would tell you that Alice was 6 years old when she died. Now, Alice's father, William Mayhew, was a prominent local Methodist and businessman. When he announced in October of 1882 that his daughter had died and that she had been quietly buried in a secret location, his status may have accounted for how little further investigation took place. But it also meant that the people of Stoke Newington were quick to fill in the gaps with rumors. That the child had been buried in Abney Park was just one. Some say she had never left the large, sprawling house. She was still there somewhere, dead or alive, depending on the teller. Another persistent rumor that seemed to have some weight of having originated with the house staff was that Alice hadn't died at all, but disappeared unaccountably from under the family's nose. But the story, which took hold among the community, was that what had killed Alice was arsenic in the nursery wallpaper. Diaries have come to light which cast a different light on these rumors and suggest a related but less straightforward answer to the mystery. The diaries, long thought lost, belonged to Alice's mother, Elizabeth Mayhew. She delighted, and I quote by Alice's mother, "She delighted me again with her talk of the birds. Such an imaginative little soul. It is the wallpaper, you see, with its darling design of birds in a tree. It has of quite late enchanted Alice. Alice speaks more and more of playing with the birds depicted on her nursery wall, telling her mother how they fly into the nursery and perch on the furniture when Alice is alone. The birds take an increasing hold on a 6-year-old. Alice's dreams about the birds, clatters away to them when she thinks nobody can hear, talks to her mother of nothing else, and begins to complain of her once cherished walks outside, pining for the nursery as soon as she leaves the house." Elizabeth writes, this business of the birds in the wall has become an unhealthy obsession. In truth, it's quite distressing. Not only does Alice talk to the birds, she tells me with great sincerity that they talk back. Not with our words, Mamma, but they talk to me. At the same time, Elizabeth recounts a decline in Alice's health. And she quotes, William thinks me most childish, but I am sure the thing to make Alice well again is to paste over those God-forsaken birds. It's hard for a mother to say, but she frightens me. My daughter frightens me. She is now in constant whispering communication with these creatures, and it becomes secretive and irritable if I dare to ask what they speak of. And she has turned to me and said, I don't like it here, she says. I don't like you, and I want to play with the birds in the wall. Eventually, however, Elizabeth's mother got her way in having the walls repapered, and Alice's health did improve. For Elizabeth, it marked an upturn in the family's fortunes. My happy, interested little girl has returned, she said. But we know that's not how the story ends. The final entry, diary entry of Elizabeth Mayhew recounts in cold, dead prose how, shortly before dawn, she had been awoken by a strange nightmare, a flutter of wings. She runs down the corridor to her daughter's room. The bed is empty, so she runs to the nursery. The nursery is empty too, dead still in the gathering light. Down the middle of the new striped blue nursery wall is a large tear, frayed at the edges as if claws have made it. Beyond is a world of leafy, birdless trees. So let's see what's going on in the comments real quick. I thought that was a really cool one. It very spooky, I think. All right, let's see. Oh my goodness, more people.
Hello, all you beautiful people out there. It's your boy Sleepy. And when I'm not guzzling down gallons and gallons of amazing ice cream, yes, oh, I love ice cream. Oh, hang on. I'm watching PBDC TV. Now, back to the show, all you beautiful people. And remember, stay nasty.
Miller is a qualified psychic and spiritual medium who gives accurate psychic readings through a range of mediums. She is a professional consultant who uses her intuition to offer guidance to all of her clients, encouraging them to move in a positive direction and face the challenges that may lie ahead of them. She is also certified Reiki Grandmaster and Shaman. Follow her on Facebook or YouTube each week for her weekly free live readings.
This is Professor Edgar Fluffosaurus from Spooky Tales with Steve the Cat, and when I'm not hosting Monster Chat or knocking down small Japanese cities, I'm watching PBDC TV. Now back to the show.
Oh my God, note to self, don't push that button I pushed. All right, let's try this again. We're going to see what's going on in the chats. There we go, okay. Okay, all right, so let's see, we've got Nick. Hi, Nick, how are you? Glad you are here. Tim. Hi, Tim. And Tim says he eats mushrooms on pizza. Just don't eat the ones there. That might not be good for your long-term or short-term health. And then Delphine says, I really enjoyed that story as well about the wallpaper. Yeah, I thought it was pretty cool. And, you know, I don't know if a lot of, I don't know. I know this is going to sound really weird, but like, I love like ghost stories and things like that. And I've just noticed that it seems to be getting harder and harder to find information on stuff. I don't know what it is. It's just, I find it very bizarre, very bizarre. Because I know that there's more stories that are connected to these cemeteries, but I can't find any, and I can't remember any off the top of my head. But I know there are, if that makes any kind of oddball sense. So yeah, it's really hard to find. It seems like a lot of information these days. Maybe, I don't know, they're trying to keep it so that they can have cemetery tours or something. I don't know. I just find it very odd. All right, so we're going to move on to the next cemetery because we have 7 we have to cover. And they just get considerably more interesting. So if you've been following me for a while, you do know some of the tales associated with this particular cemetery that we're about to talk about, and that would be the Brompton Cemetery. Now, it was originally the west of London Westminster Cemetery. Now, Brompton Cemetery is a London cemetery managed by the Royal Parks. It is in West Brompton in the Royal Brought of Kensington and Chelsea. It is one of the magnificent 7 cemeteries, of course, or we wouldn't be talking about it. And again, this one was also established by the Act of Parliament and laid out in 1839. It did open in 1840. And let's see, it was consecrated by Charles James Bloomfield, Bishop of London. So he consecrated a lot of these cemeteries as far as the Magnificent 7, as far as the consecrated side of them. So let's see, he consecrated that in June of 1940. It is one of Britain's oldest and most distinguished garden cemeteries. Some 35,000 monuments, from simple headstones to substantial mausolea, mark more than 205,000 resting places. The site includes large plots for family mausolea and common graves where coffins were piled deep into the earth. And we talked about that practice too. It was very common for them to be 10 coffins deep. Give me just 1 second. All right. So let's see. So yeah, there are some stacked graves in this particular cemetery. It also has a small columbarium. I have to look at my phonetically spelling on that one because you want to pronounce it different. Um, as well as a secluded garden of remembrance at the northern end for cremated remains. Why do you have to have it quieter for cremated remains? That's just I don't know. My dark humor wants to go somewhere with that. Now the cemetery continues to be open for burials. It also is known as an urban haven for nature. In 2014, it was awarded a national lottery grant to carry out essential restoration and develop a visitor center along with other improvements, which I find odd, being that this particular cemetery is managed by the Crown. So why would it get the lottery grant? Why not all of them? Why not Bow Cemetery? That's the one that should get the grant. And we'll get to that one. I think that is my favorite cemetery. If you want to grow a haunted cemetery, that's how you do it. But anyway, it was awarded the National Lottery Grant to help cover costs. Now, although the cemetery was originally established by a private company, like I said, the property is now the property of the Crown. The site, previously a market garden, Brompton Cemetery was eventually designed by architect Benjamin Bald with at its center a modest sandstone dome chapel, which is dated 1839, at its southern end, reached by two symmetrically long colonnades in the style of St. Peter's Square in Rome. So yeah, they got that going on, and flanked in itself by catacombs as well. It was intended to give the feel of a large open air cathedral. Now, below the colonnades are catacombs as well, which were originally conceived as a cheaper, at least as far as this particular cemetery is concerned, a cheaper alternative to burial, having a plot in the ground of the cemetery. So in some, it's considered more expensive, in others, it's considered cheaper. Now, unfortunately, however, with this particular cemetery, the catacombs weren't really that big of a hit, and they didn't succeed. And only about 500 of them, of many thousands of ones that they have available down there, were sold. Now, during World War II, the cemetery itself did suffer bombing damage. Brompton was closed to burials between 1952 and 1966, except for family and Polish interments, but is once again a working cemetery with plots for interments and a garden of remembrance for the deposits of cremated remains. Now, notable interments or burials at this particular cemetery would be Joseph Bonamy the Younger, and we have spoken about him, and we're going to get to him here in a minute. He was a sculptor, artist, Egyptologist, and museum curator. Fanny Barne was John Keats' muse. She's buried under her married name, Frances Linden. Henry Cole, he was the founder of the Victrola and Albert Museum, or the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Royal Albert Hall, the Royal College of Music, and the 1851 Great Expedition, and inventor of the Christmas card. So without Mr. Cole, we wouldn't have a Christmas card. Joseph Thomas Clover is also an interment. He was the pioneer of anesthesia. We all need to thank Joseph Thomas Clover for anesthesia. Yes, sir. Also, and this I just found funny, so I had to include it. Sir Charles James Freake. Now, he was an untrained architect and builder and was the creator of much of South Kensington. So my question, I have all kinds of questions. Is he there because he was an untrained architect and builder and something happened to him, or what? I just have so many questions, but I just found that my dark humor again, found that funny. Um, Also, Kit Lambert. Um, some of you may know him as the music producer and original manager of The Who. Also interned here is Ernest Thiesinger. He was a character actor in The Old Dark House and The Bride of Frankenstein. Let's see, Sir Andrew Scott Wall. He was an Army officer and surveyor who named the highest mountain in the world after Sir George Everest. So he named Mount Everest. As well as J.P. Knight, he was the inventor of the first traffic light. So I don't know how we feel about that. But yeah, he did that thing. So before we move on to the story that is associated with Brompton, let's go ahead, Oz, and take a look at Brompton Cemetery. All right, we stop there. All right, so like I said, some of you guys may remember this story, and it's a pretty interesting story, pretty interesting mystery. So we're going to talk about the Brompton Time Machine. Now, in the middle of Brompton Cemetery in London stands a fascinating mausoleum in Egyptian style. It is the largest and most elaborate construction in Brompton. It would be remarkable for its imposing stature alone, but there is more to this story. It is believed to be a fully functional time machine. Now, Hannah Courtoy, also born with the last name of Peters, was a mysterious woman. She never married, but she inherited a fortune from an elderly merchant by the name of John Courtoy. She worked for him as a housekeeper and later took his name. There are rumors that she was his mistress, but also the mistress of kings and politicians and other rich and powerful men. Like many Victorians of the era, Hannah was intrigued by the Egyptian iconography, particularly hieroglyphics. Therefore, it is not surprising that she and two of their three daughters, Elizabeth and Mary Ann, rest in the tomb with many Egyptian characteristics. The mausoleum was designed by two of Hannah's good friends, Joseph Bonanomy, which he's buried here, as well as Samuel Alfred Warner. Now, Samuel Alfred Warner was an inventor. Some people think that he was a genius who invented the torpedo. Others believe that he was just a fraud who tried to convince the British Army to finance his development of several advanced weapons, too advanced to actually exist. On the other hand, Joseph Bonamy was a noted Egyptologist, artist, sculptor, and museum curator. He was among the first to decipher some of the hieroglyphic texts found in the Valley of the Kings. The story goes that Bonamy discovered the secret of time traveling. From the hieroglyphics, he saw on one of his expeditions. Supposedly, the two men convinced Hannah to finance their secret project to design and build a mausoleum that would actually be a time machine. By placing their device in a cemetery, they ensured that no one could interfere with their journey through time, since cemeteries rarely change. The mausoleum was finished in 1853, 5 years after Hannah died. Shortly after the completion of construction, Warner died under suspicious circumstances. Some say he died because of what he discovered while working on the time machine. Others say that Bonamy killed Warner to stop him from telling anyone about their project. Another version of the story is that Warner didn't die at all and simply traveled in time and disappeared. Both Warner and Bonamy are buried in Brompton Cemetery, Warner in an unmarked grave and Bonamy in the immediate vicinity of the mausoleum. There is a depiction of Hannah's tomb on his modest headstone and an illustration of Anubis, the Egyptian god of the dead, looking in the direction of the mausoleum as well. But this is just one detail that supports the story of the mausoleum being a time machine. There are also strange wheel motifs on the bottom of the mausoleum door and a large circular hole in the top with 8 smaller holes surrounding it. Some say it looks like a clock or dial was supposed to be in that place. Furthermore, for almost every structure in the Brompton Cemetery, there exists an architect's plan, but not for this mausoleum. To make everything even more mysterious, the key to the mausoleum went missing, so no one was able to see or has been able to see what is inside the mausoleum for more than 150 years. All right, so we're going to take a look real quick, and I'm going to try not to touch that button. See what's going on in the comments real quick. Oh, and Jenny says the best part of being an adult is getting to have lovely people like you as our teachers. Well, I really enjoy this. I really do. And I have to kind of just share my fascination with everybody. I love spooky dark history. It's so much fun. It's kind of like playing detective sometimes. And then Akia says your bow looks like a tiny little outfit with the hands reaching to adjust the bow. It's amusing for me for some reason now. Oh my goodness. All right. So I don't want to mess with things too much because I don't want to blink out on y'all. All right. Okay. So if I missed your comment, I am so very sorry. I will go back after the feed. I just don't want to be moving it around too much because I don't want to get cut off again. So, all right. So this particular cemetery was originally known as All Saints Cemetery, and is perhaps the least famous or celebrated of the Magnificent Seven. This would be Nun's Head Cemetery. Now, the cemetery is located in Nun Head in the London borough of Southwark and opened by the London Cemetery Company. Consecrated in 1840 with an Anglican chapel designed by Thomas Little. The first burial was of Charles Abbott. He was a 101-year-old Ipswich grocer. The last burial was of a volunteer soldier who became a canon of Lahore Cathedral. The first grave in Nunhead was dug in October of 1840. The average annual number of burials over 10 years in 1868 to 1878 was 1,685. Of those, 1,350 were in the consecrated section, and 335 were in the unconsecrated section. In the cemetery were reinterred remains that were removed in 1867 and 1933 from the site of the demolished St. Christopher Leastock Church in City of London. Okay, so that was a little confusing. So there was a demolished church in the city of London, and so they had to take the cemetery that was there and basically kind of do like they did back in 1839 when they did all the reinterments and everything because of the non-burial clause in London. So they were knocking down this church. They had to find something to do with the people in the cemetery, so they all got moved here. Now, the cemetery contains examples of the most imposing monuments to the most eminent citizens of the day, which contrast sharply with the also smaller, simple headstones marking common or public burials. By the middle of the 20th century, the cemetery was nearly full, and so was abandoned by the United Cemetery Company. With the ensuing neglect, the cemetery gradually changed from lawn to meadow and then eventually woodland. It is now a local nature reserve. A lack of care and cash surrendered the graves to the ravages of nature and vandalism. But in the early 1980s, the Friends of Nunhead Cemetery were formed to renovate and protect the cemetery. The cemetery was reopened in May of 2001 after an extensive restoration project funded by Southwark Council and the Heritage Lottery Fund. So some lottery funds did go to this one. That's good. 50 memorials were restored along with the Anglican chapel. At 52 acres, Nunhead is actually the second largest of the Magnificent Seven. The Victorian part of the cemetery, however, is still currently in very poor state of repair, and so it's just kind of overgrown. Now, there is a notable burial here, a Brian Donkin. Now, he was the engineer who developed both a paper making machine as well as the food canning process. So that's pretty interesting. So let's take a look at Nunhead Cemetery because it has a monster of its own. All right, we stop there. All right, so now Highgate may have its vampire, but Nunhead has a phantom. This phantom is a 6 foot 8 inch tall Bank of England clerk. In 1923, the remains of William Jenkins, he was a lifelong employee of the bank, were removed from the City of London offices Court Garden burial ground and reinterred in a catacomb at the Nunhead Cemetery. Here they rested until the 1970s when the abandoned cemetery was invaded by hooligans and the graves and coffins violated and robbed. That also included Jenkins' last resting place, which was as well vandalized and stripped of the lead. So the area was stripped of lead so that the vandals could, basically trade that in. It was said that such desecration, no doubt, was the direct result of this paranormal phenomenon, and it is the ghost of the bank clerk which is said to haunt the graveyard. Now, in 1975, a workman saw a tall, dark stranger dressed totally in black emerge from one of the crumbling catacombs and disappear into the surrounding undergrowth. The phantom of William Jenkins is not the only apparition to have been witnessed at Nunhead Cemetery. Again, in 1970s, a group of people walking their dog through the cemetery saw the figure of a woman in Victorian dress holding a lantern gliding along a path. I want to see something like that. I really do. As the group approached her, the lady vanished. Now, of course, spectral children have also been seen at the cemetery. One night, a man walking by the entrance to the graveyard saw and heard a group of youngsters playing and laughing along the graves. As he looked through the bars of the gates, he says he says their presence and sound gradually faded into the darkness. The man was convinced he had seen the ghosts of children. But who could these children be? Now, in 1912, 9 Sea Scouts, which were children, were laid to rest at Nunhead after drowning in a boat incident off the Isle of Shepley, which is also off the coast of Kent. So, yeah, there's that. Now, we're about to get to, I think this is going to be my favorite cemetery. I really, really find this cemetery interesting. And we're going to talk about Tower Hamlet Cemetery, also better known as Bow Cemetery, B-O-W. So we're going to refer to it as Bow. Now, Bow Cemetery is a historic cemetery in the London Borough of Towers Hamlets in the East End of London. The cemetery opened in 1841 and closed for burials in 1966. The cemetery today encompasses the original cemetery, bounded by historical walls, as well as additional pockets of land. Now, it was originally named the City of London and Tower Hamlets Cemetery, but like I said, is now called the Bow Cemetery by locals. And some of this is going to make you really, it made me very upset. Like, not happy, upset. Now, the City of London and Tower Hamlets Cemetery Company was made up of 11 wealthy directors whose occupation reflected the industries of the day. You had corn merchant, a merchant shipbroker, a ship owner, timber merchant, and a Lord Mayor of the City of London. The company bought 27 acres of land, and the cemetery was divided as well into consecrated parts for the Anglican burials and unconsecrated parts for the other denominations. Now, Tower Hamlet Cemetery was formally consecrated by Bishop of London Charles James Bloomfield as well on Saturday, September 4th of 1841, prior to be opened for burials. The cemetery was consecrated in the morning, and the first burial took place in the afternoon. Now, Tower Hamlet Cemetery was very popular with people from the East End, and by 1889, over 247,000 bodies had been interned. The cemetery remained open for another 77 years. And if you remember when we were talking about a lot of like when the funeral insurance came out around this time, or the funeral clubs, the burial clubs came out, this particular cemetery is where a lot of those mass type graves went. Like, there's a lot of mass graves in this particular cemetery. Now, in the first 2 years, 60% of the burials were in public graves, which means like Potterfield graves. And by 1851, that had increased to 80%. The public graves were the property of the company and were used to bury those whose families could not afford to buy a plot. Several persons entirely unrelated to each other could be buried in the same grave within the space of a few weeks. Allegedly, some graves were dug 40 feet deep and contained up to 30 bodies. The cemetery itself did not remain in a tidy and elegant state for long. Only 55 years after it was opened, it was reported to be neglected in a state of neglect. During the Second World War, the cemetery was bombed 5 times during the raids on the City of London. Both cemetery chapels were damaged, and shrapnel damage can still be seen today on the graves by the 1994 Sonane Center in the northwest corner of the park. So you can still see some of the shrapnel damage in certain parts of this particular cemetery. Now, burials continued taking place until 1966, when the Greater London Council, the GLC, bought the company for £100,000 under £100,000. Under the GLC Act, the ground was closed for burials. The intention, though, was to create an open space for the public. And relevant parts of the cemetery were freed from effects of consecration. So, what that meant was they were trying to remove the headstones, they were trying to remove the graves, so they could have an open space for public, which to me probably says a parking space, a parking lot. And understand this particular when this particular cemetery has so much history, like interesting people and things that still go on there today. And they were basically just trying to erase it so that they could, in my opinion, what it looks like, put in a parking lot. Now, in October of 1967, and a further 125,000 pounds were spent clearing the chapels. So they knocked down all the chapels and 0.68 acres of graves. Strong local opposition and problems of funding stopped the clearance. Thank goodness. The Tower Hamlets London Borough Council then took over the ownership of the park in 1986. It was declared a local nature reserve in May of 2000, along with adjacent open lands on Cantrell Road and Ackroyd Drive. It has also been designated as the site of metropolitan importance for nature conservation and a conservation area. Now, the high brick walls which surround it are on the National Registry of listed buildings, as are 7 individual memorials. So that's good. That means that most likely they can never be like messed with. Now, notable burials and just some kind of weird stories that go along with this one. Charlie Brown. Charlie Brown is buried there. And no, I'm not talking about the cartoon character. Now, Charlie Brown was a publican of the Railway Tavern. Who is buried here is Charles Jamrick. He was the animal supplier to P.T. Barnum and others, as well as Dr. Reese Ralph Llewellyn. Now, if you notice that name, he was the one that performed the autopsy on Mary Ann Nichols, who is considered the first victim of Jack the Ripper. Henry Norris is also interned here. He was a civil engineer who began his career with the repairs to the then Eddystone Lighthouse, and later on supervised the construction of the very first lighthouse that was built and wired for electrical light. Now, John Northey died, or is here. He died in the Princess Alice disaster of 1878. And what is that? What is the Princess Alice disaster? Well, the SS Princess Alice, formerly the PS Butte, which anybody knows you don't rename a boat, was a British passenger paddle steamer that sank on the 3rd of September, 1878, after a collision with the Collier SS Bywell Castle on the River Thames, or Thames. I always want to say Thames, on the River Thames. Now, this particular collision caused the death of between 600 and 700 people, all from Prince Alice, and the greatest loss of life of any British inland waterway shipping accident. No passenger list or head count was ever made, so the exact figure of those who died has never been known. So, horrible disaster. Killed a bunch of people. Also interned here is Hannah Maria Purcell. Now, Miss Purcell was the widow of William Purcell. He was the carpenter of the HMS Bounty. Yes, Mr. Christian and all. The mutiny on the Bounty. Also, some victims of the Bethnal Green disaster. And again, we kind of went over this when we were going over one of the cemeteries a little earlier, and that would be the Bethnal Green incident. Now, the Bethnal Green is a London Underground station in Bethnal Green, London, served by the Central Line. It lies between Liverpool Street and Mile End Station. It is normally open 24 hours on a Friday and Saturday as part of the night tube service. The station was opened as part of the long-planned Central Line Eastern Extension on the 4th of December, 1946, having previously been used as an air raid shelter. On the 3rd of March of 1943, 173 people, including 62 children, were killed in and crushed while attempting to enter the shelter, in what is believed to be the largest loss of civilian life in the UK during the Second World War. Now, the Tower Hamlets is supposedly also one of the most haunted cemeteries in London. And if you look at some of the people that are buried here, there is no surprise, absolutely no surprise that this is probably the most haunted cemetery in London. But let's first take a look at the pictures, and it fits its name. Super spooky little cemetery. All right, we can stop there. All right, so let's talk about some other things that have happened here and some of the people that are buried here. And things are still happening today. Like, there's a lot of like murder and stuff that goes on in this little cemetery. So the Tower Hamlets is supposedly one of the most haunted cemeteries in London. Now, one of the reasons Tower Hamlets Cemetery is in such a rough state, or was in such a rough state in the middle of the 20th century, was, of course, because of the Blitz. The Luftwaffe heavily targeted the nearby docklands, and the cemetery suffered collateral damage. In 1952, a memorial was erected to those who died in the air raids. Now, this memorial was made out of bricks taken from bomb properties. So they already probably were impregnated with ghosts. So they took impregnated bricks and made a memorial for people that got killed in the air raid. So yeah. The 3 policemen in one grave. Frugality is in the nature of this cemetery, as most of its inhabitants didn't have enough money to pay for elaborate burials or even their own personal plot. Now, a curious example can be found in one grave which holds 3 policemen. All the men worked at Leman Street Police Station in Limehouse, which was a very rough area. They did not, as you might expect, however, die together. The men didn't even die within a close period of time of each other, nor did they all die in the line of service. So there is little explanation as to why they 3 share the same grave. Now, for one, PC Richard Barber. Now, he died when chasing a suspect across rooftops and falling through a skylight. PC William Pasher, he met his end when he drowned on holiday in Margate. And PC Ernest Thompson was killed in 1900 when he was trying to break up a scuffle and was stabbed in the neck for his troubles. So yeah, I find that one extremely interesting. So let's see what's going on in the comments real quick, and then we're going to get to our last cemetery, the Victorian Valhalla. Hey Spook, how are you? Let's see. Apparently, Akia has glitter coming out her hair, which is kind of cool. Just kind of cool. All right. Okay, so again, referred to as the Victorian Valhalla. Let me wet my whistle. Highgate Cemetery has to come to mind, and usually is one of, if you're a tapophile, if you really love cemeteries, this is probably more than likely on your bucket list. It's very well known. Now, Highgate Cemetery is a place of burial in North London, England. There are approximately 170,000 people buried in around 50,000 graves. You think it'd be more, actually, that cover the area across the west and east cemetery. So it's actually got a west cemetery and an east cemetery. The cemetery is in Highgate North 6, next to the Waterloo Park, in the London Borough of Camden. It comprises two sites on either side of Swains Lane. The main gate is on Swains Lane, just north of Oakshott Avenue. There is another disguised gate on Chester Road. Now, the cemetery, in its original form, the northwestern wooded area, opened in 1839. So the west side is where you're going to find all your really, really old, um, like monuments and things like that. On Monday, May 20th of 1839, Highgate West Cemetery was dedicated to St. James by the Right Reverend Charles James Bloomfield, Lord Bishop of London. 15 acres were consecrated for the use of the Church of England, and 2 acres set aside for dissenters. Rights of burial were sold either for a limited period of time or in perpetuity. So, in other words, you could either A, buy a lot and be there forever. They plant you, you don't go anywhere. Or you could have it for a limited period. So basically, you want to look like you've got a lot of money. So what you do is you go and you rent the space until everybody that knows you dies. And then once that time period runs out, they reintern your body, most likely in a potter's field of some sort. Now, that I don't think that was very popular. And so they didn't do that. I don't think they do that anymore, to be very honest with you. Now, the first burial was Elizabeth Jackson of Little Windmill Street in Soho on the 26th of May. Highgate, like the others of the Magnificent Seven, soon became a fashionable place for burials and was much admired and visited. The Victorian romantic attitude to death and its presentation led to the creation of a labyrinth of Egyptian sepulchres and a wealth of Gothic tombs and buildings. And I will tell you, the amount, and I have to say it because it applies to history and it applies to this cemetery. The sheer amount of people that supported communism, like activists for communism and things like that, are buried here. Karl Marx is buried here. Now, I know he wasn't well, they say he's the father of socialism, I guess, but the odd thing about it is that Highgate was like pomp and ceremony and very well-to-do. Like you would have thought, just based on theology, that a lot of these people would have been buried in somewhere like Bow, somewhere that was like more for the common people and things like that. I find that ironic and missionable. That there were quite a few of them that wanted to be buried in this little, prestigious little cemetery of the haves. I found that extremely interesting. So anyway, the rows of silent stone angels have borne witness to pomp, like I said, and ceremony, as well as some dreadful exhumations. And we're going to get into that later. These avenues of death entomb poets, painters, princes, paupers. There are at least 850 notable people buried at Highgate, including 18 royal academics, 6 Lord Mayors of London, 48 Fellows of the Royal Society. Now, Highgate Cemetery occupies a spectacular south-facing hillside site, slightly downhill from the top of Highgate Hill, next to the Waterloo Park. In 1854, a further 19 acres to the south east of the original area across Swains Lane was bought to form the eastern part of the cemetery. Now, this opened in 1860. Both sides, believe it or not, of the cemetery are still used today for burials. Highgate Cemetery is a place of rich history, scandal, and mystery. celebrity, hidden secrets, and sudden splendors. As far as the West Cemetery, you will find the Egyptian Avenue and the Circle of Lebanon, previously surmounted by a huge 280-year-old cedar of Lebanon, which had to be cut down and replaced, unfortunately, in August of 2019. This area features tombs, vaults, and winding paths dug into the hillside. There are many carved angels guarding the graves in Highgate in all weathers, but one of the finest is shielded from the sun and storm. You can find this angel in the Beer family mausoleum in the West Cemetery. Take note of the beautiful mosaic and gold leaf dome when you go, and the touching memorial to Ada, the daughter of Julius Beer, who died age 8. She is shown being embraced by an angel on a marble relief that is by Henry Hugh Armstead above her father's tomb. You'll also see a lion who isn't a lion. Lion, whose statue guards the grave of Victorian pugilist Tom Sayers, is in fact a dog. He is immortalized, lying patiently with his head on his paws on his master's tomb. Slayer's final fight with American John C. Heenan was a marathon attended by several MPs, in spite of the fact that such fights were illegal at the time and ended in a controversial draw. Slayers became a champion to the people of London and retired after a public subscription raised enough money for him to be able to leave the ring. Lion was chief mourner at Sayers' funeral, traveling in his own pony cart, which was watched by many thousands of well-wishers, fans, and friends who accompanied the hearse from Camden. The real Ophelia is buried here. When we think of Shakespeare's tragic heroine Ophelia, we often think of the paintings of her floating along the flowers as painted by John Everett Millas. Highgate is the final resting place of Elizabeth Sindall, muse of the pre-Raphaelites and model for that masterpiece. Lizzie had to pose day after day lying in a bathtub as Millas painted her for his iconic, unsettling image, and she wound up catching pneumonia when the lamps used to warm the bath water went out. And Millas, engrossed in his work, didn't even notice. Millas did, however, agree to pay her medical bills, and an artist and poet herself, she wound up marrying Gabriele Dante Rossetti in 1860, but died tragically young just 2 years later. She's buried with the Rossetti family plot, or in the Rossetti family plot. Her husband had her body disinterred, however, some years later to retrieve a handwritten book of poems that he himself had placed in her coffin. And the story basically is like many artists, they become popular when they die, and she became her poems became popular, and so he had her dug up so that he could retrieve the book of poems that he had buried with her so that he could sell it. Yeah. That's how you get haunted by ghosts, right there. Now, today, for its protection, the oldest section, with its impressive collection of Victorian mausoleums and gravestones, plus elaborate carved tombs, allow admissions only on tour groups. So the west side, you can only go on tour groups. The newer section, or east side, which contains most of the angel statuary, however, can still be toured unescorted. Now, notable interns of, I believe this is the west. Yeah, I believe this is the west. Abraham D. Barnett, he was a zoologist and superintendent of the London Zoo, known for selling the popular African elephant Jumbo to P.T. Barnum. John Etchler was the horse who was slaughtered to Queen Victoria. Edward Blore, architect known for his work on Buckingham Palace and Westminster Abbey. Edward Brett, publisher and pioneer of the serialized sensational weekly fiction Penny Dreadfuls. James Bunstone Bunning, city architect to the City of London. Alfred Lambert Dixon, the younger brother of Dickens, the younger brother of Charles Dickens. Catherine Dickens, wife of Charles Dickens. John and Elizabeth Dickens, parents of Charles Dickens. Fanny Dickens, elder sister of Charles Dickens. But there is no Mr. Dickens. He's not there. Michael Faraday. Now, if you recognize that last name, the Faraday cage. Michael Faraday was a chemist and like a physicist with his wife Sarah. They are in the dissenter section. John William Griffith was the architect for Kensal Green Cemetery. So the architect of Kensal Green wanted to be buried in Highgate. Edward Hill, older brother to Rowland Hill, an inventor of the first letter scale and the mechanical system to make envelopes. So basically, he is seen as the father of the mail system that we know now. Thomas Hopley, and I had to include this because of my dark humor. Thomas Hopley was the headmaster who beat one of his pupils to death. William Hoskins, first professor of architecture at King's College, London, and architect of Abney Park Cemetery. George Michael, singer, songwriter, music producer, and philanthropist. He is buried beside his mother and sister. Tom Smith, inventor of the Christmas cracker. And no, not the kind of cracker you eat, but like the kind you pull apart and they make like a what am I trying to say? Oh my gosh. A daggone firework. The little pull things that make the little pow pow sounds. Shepard Osborne, he was a Royal Navy admiral and Arctic explorer. Charles Green Spencer, he was a pioneer aviator and balloon manufacturer, like the big hot air balloons. Frederick Tennyson, poet, older brother of Alfred Lord Tennyson. Adam Worth, he was a criminal mastermind, possible inspiration for Sherlock Holmes' nemesis, Professor Moriarty. Originally, however, buried in a pauper's grave under the name Henry J. Raymond. So he was reinterned under his real name, Adam Worth. But yeah, I find that kind of neat. So possibly the inspiration for Professor Moriarty. In the East Cemetery, many famous or prominent people are buried on the side of the Highgate Cemetery. The most famous of which is arguably that of Karl Marx, whose tomb, however, was the site of attempted bombings twice, on September 2nd, 1965, and in 1970. Also, in the East Cemetery, you will find the Fireman's Corner. It is a monument erected in the East Cemetery by widows and orphans of members of the London Fire Brigade of 1934. There are 97 firemen buried there. Other notable internments: Douglas Adams, who was the author of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and other novels. Faraz Bazoff, he was a journalist who was executed by Saddam Hussein. Karl Mayer, Astro-German screenwriter of, and this is for you, Akia, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. George Eliot is also buried. Now, some of the graves in Highgate attract particular offerings. The grave of George Eliot, who wrote Middlemarch and Silas Mariner, is regularly found rustling with pens offered by admirers. Now, Eliot, though, whose real name was Mary Ann Evans, is buried there next to her common-law husband, George Henry Lewes, with whom she lived, to the dismay of respectable Victorian society, unmarried for more than 20 years. Also here, you will find punk hero Malcolm McLaurin's. He has a dramatic monument which includes his death mask. Malcolm McLaurin was the original manager of the Sex Pistols. As far as Highgate is concerned, there have been several movies made here. Footage from Highgate appears in numerous British horror films, including Taste the Blood of Dracula, Tales from the Crypt, and From Beyond the Grave. Stated in the acknowledgments of one of my absolute favorite books, it was the inspiration for the setting of Neil Gaiman's The Graveyard Book. And also in the movie Fantastic Beasts, The Crimes of Grindelwald, featured scenes toward the end of the film in the cemetery before the famous cedar tree can be seen, and this was prior to the cedar tree being removed. So, yeah, so let's go ahead and let's show some pictures. This is going to encompass both east and west of Highgate. And then we'll get on to the Highgate Vampire. All right. So it's dark history. Now, sadism and sex rituals, vampires, and duels. Highgate Cemetery was the inspiration behind Christopher Lee's Dracula, but its true story is even stranger than that of the classic Hammer horror films. In 1970, Highgate Cemetery was run down, overgrown, and undeniably spooky, a place tailor-made for occult happenings. And I got this just because it is just a real good example of putting the whole story of the Highgate Vampire together. And you can find this at www.thesecret.city, things to do, // Highgate Cemetery. So you'll find it under Highgate Cemetery at the www.thesecret.city. All right. So in February of that year, David Farrant, this is in 1970, the owner of a local tobacconist, claimed he had seen something strange, a ghost-like creature. He grew convinced that satanic rituals had been taking place within Highgate Cemetery grounds, and that an evil entity had been summoned there from another realm. The more he investigated, the more it consumed him, and he was not alone. Farrant's claims were attracting attention. Others agreed that something odd was afoot, and no one agreed more loudly than Sean Manchester. Sean Manchester was the self-proclaimed president of the British Occult Society. Manchester claimed to have spoken with people who lived in the area, victims of bizarre attacks. Two, he said, had awoke in their bedrooms to the sight of a beast-like man. A third had 2 unexplained red marks on her neck. Manchester drew the obvious conclusion. Highgate Cemetery was home to a vampire, and not just any vampire. It was home to Dracula. Farrant, however, rubbished these claims. Vampire, he said, be reasonable. Only fools believe in vampires. What we're dealing with here is a ghost-like evil from another realm. Vampires. I have never heard such nonsense. A rival grew between the two, and the media ate it up. ITV arranged a witching hour in which they could prove their claims. On Friday the 13th, 1970, Ferrant and Manchester met up at Highgate Cemetery. Both pledged to get to the truth. They weren't the only ones interested, however. Also to show up was a ramble of vampire hunters also gathered outside the cemetery, eager to find out more for themselves. 40 police officers were brought in to maintain order, but they were soon overwhelmed. Armed with crucifixes, stakes, knives, and beer bottles, the crowd streamed over the cemetery railings. Screams tore through the darkness. Left, right, and center, vampire hunters hurled to each other. The cemetery was wrecked. Graves were dug up, and iron stakes were plunged into coffins. But not a ghoul nor a vampire was found. Throughout the months that followed, the police regularly patrolled Highgate Cemetery, but they couldn't stop further strangeness from happening. Graves were dislodged, and there were reports of Satanism. In August of 1970, a young woman's dug-up corpse was found charred and headless on the road outside the cemetery. That same month, the police arrested Ferrant for staking a nearby churchyard and for stalking in a nearby churchyard, a crucifix in one hand and a stake in the other. Despite this run-in with the law, however, Ferrant continued to pursue the Highgate Cemetery ghoul undeterred. His nemesis, Manchester, wrote 2 books on the Highgate Cemetery vampire. Their feud grew and grew, and the two of them decided to settle things once and for all. In 1973, they agreed to have a series of duels involving swords and sorcery. There is no evidence that these ever happened, however, and many thought the duo more a threat to others than to themselves. Word got out that they wanted to kill a cat in the presence of naked virgins. Not long after, a local pet cat was found dead. Ferrant was instantly made prime suspect. And in 1974, Ferrant was arrested again. He was charged with damaging of local property and disturbing the dead, and went on to serve a 3-year prison sentence. Now, while his rival was rotting in jail, Manchester took the initiative. He tracked down the vampire, he says, thrust a stake through its heart, he says, and then it burst into flames. At least that's his story. And guys, that is the end of London's Magnificent Seven. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you liked the pictures. I hope those of you that are out there that just found out you really, really dig those old cemeteries, welcome to the family. But I know a lot of us already here really dig them. So I hope you enjoyed that. That was a lot of fun. We are now off for the season. So I will see you next year. Pleasant nightmares, everybody. Bye.
This is Mr. Applewhite speaking. There is nothing wrong with your device. Join me here on Psycho Money DC. A delightfully dreadful consternation of horror content. Turn heads